Hi, you're on the Nomad of Dreams channel. Today, I'll talk about Socrates' philosophy and about why his way of thinking still influences how we reason about the good and about knowledge. I'll explain what exactly makes Socrates a significant thinker, his ability to place knowledge at the center of moral questions and to turn dispute into inquiry. We'll unpack the key ideas, their internal logic, and the practical consequences for how to live and think. Where are you listening from and what time is it for you now? Write it in the comments. I like seeing where the responses come from and when people tune in. Take a deep breath, release the tension in your shoulders, breathe evenly. It's easier to follow thinking aloud that way. Socrates as a thinker is an example of a philosophy oriented toward the practice of life. His thought is a way of asking questions about the good and about knowledge, not a set of finished answers. Socratic philosophy is a way of seeing the world through the demands of conceptual clarity and honesty of argument. It values precise definitions and logical consistency. This approach still works because it relies on universal mechanisms of thought, the ability to spot contradictions, to pose a question instead of an assertion, and to demand a rational basis for moral judgments. Such skills remain relevant in any culture and at any time where one needs to think clearly and responsibly. The main idea around which everything converges is the recognition of one's ignorance as the starting point of knowledge. Realizing the limits of one's own understanding turns from a modest remark into a methodological stance. Acknowledging ignorance opens a space for genuine inquiry. This is not a play on words, but a practical position that changes the character of the conversation. Instead of hasty, confident statements, there appears a desire to clarify terms, verify premises, and systematically test conclusions. This approach makes philosophy more a discipline of the mind than a species of eloquence. It's important for me to show how this method relates to ethics. When knowledge is placed at the center of moral reasoning, morality ceases to be a set of habitual rules and becomes a question of understanding what constitutes a good action. To understand what is right and to be able to explain it, that is to approach virtue as a kind of knowledge. This changes the attitude to education and upbringing. The main task is not to memorize rules, but to learn to think in such a way that good deeds follow from clear convictions. Besides a method of inquiry, Socratic philosophy emphasizes care for the soul. For him, a person's inner life is more important than external success and reputation. Care for the soul implies constant reflection, readiness for self-examination, and correcting beliefs as thought becomes clearer. Such a stance turns philosophy into a practice of life. Thought is inseparable from action, and reasoning from self-knowledge. A special role is given to argumentation and honesty in reasoning. The demand for precise definitions and logical sequence serves as a filter for casual opinions and rhetorical tricks. When concepts are clarified, dispute acquires a different quality. It becomes a means of purifying beliefs, not an arena for winning with words. Irony and modesty in manner of speaking often act as tools that help reveal internal contradictions and push for a deep analysis of one's assertions. In this series, I will show how the main techniques of Socratic thinking work. Acknowledging ignorance as a start, the question as an instrument for uncovering presuppositions, refutation of contradictions as a way to clarify beliefs, and maieutic as a method of helping another person discover their own thoughts. I will also dwell on how these ideas relate to the concept of virtue, autonomy of judgment, and responsibility for one's own beliefs. The key thought around which everything is built now is simple. Conscious ignorance is not a weakness, but a method that makes genuine understanding possible. Conscious ignorance is a stance of recognizing the limits of one's own understanding as the beginning of reflection, not as the end. It is not a passive admission, but an active method. To say, "I don't know," means to open the door for systematic inquiry and for demanding grounds. Such a start turns a dispute into a laboratory of thought, where premises are tested rather than taken on faith. When you admit that you don't have the answer, not only the tone of the conversation changes, but its logic too. Candidness about gaps creates a demand for definitions, makes hidden assumptions obvious, and forces you to look for connecting links between concepts. A schematic emerges in the mind. First clarify, then advance arguments, then check for internal consistency. This scheme turns discussion from competition into a joint process of clarification. The practical effect of such a stance is a reduction in the rate of false assertions and an increased likelihood of detecting contradictions at early stages of thinking. Conscious ignorance works as a discipline of attention. When you consciously mark a statement as temporary, a habit arises to ask where it came from and on what grounds it stands. Inner doubt ceases to be a source of anxiety and becomes a filtering tool. This demand for clarity encourages formulating definitions and separating observation from inference. As a result, the quality of belief changes. It becomes transparent, measurable, and movable in favor of the argument rather than habit. The method ranks knowledge by degree of justification. Having confidence turns out to be an insufficient criterion. More important is the sequence of reasoning and the absence of hidden assumptions. Such a framework helps distinguish beliefs that will withstand scrutiny from those that collapse under simple clarification of terms. In everyday life, this looks like a readiness to postpone a final verdict until the grounds are checked, not like perpetual indecision. You keep the ability to act, but you do so with an explicit understanding of the level of your knowledge. The limits of this stance are clear too. The method is useful where there is time and opportunity for discussion, and where concepts lend themselves to verbalization and logical analysis. In emergency situations, when immediate action is required and delayed discussion is dangerous, prolonged acknowledgement of ignorance can become an impediment. Another limit lies in areas requiring expert skill, where admitting general ignorance does not replace professional knowledge. Where accumulated practical experience is available, the open stance must be combined with respect for competence. Otherwise, one risks acting unreasonably. There are also domains where language itself is slippery, and meticulous clarification does not always dissolve problems, because the questions go beyond the bounds of logical clarity. Socrates made the recognition of his own ignorance a central move in reasoning. His genuine surprise and ability to pose questions allowed him to uncover disagreements in his interlocutor's premises and conclusions, while at the same time setting a plan of testing for his own thought. Socrates used this principle as a method of cultivating thought. Acknowledge ignorance, ask a question, insist on a definition, check the sequence. It is precisely through such a sequence of thoughts, and not through external authoritative knowledge, that he proposed an approach to virtue and rational action. If you adopt this technique in your practice, remember its limits and that intellectual honesty is a demand both on you and on those you reason with. The problem is that conversations about the significant often pass by the very essence of what is being discussed. People hold statements as given, not noticing that the grounds of their reasoning are fragmented and sometimes contradict one another. When premises are hidden and unresolved, argument becomes an exchange of opinions without checking the logic and meaning of words. This creates the illusion of knowledge that blocks real mental work. Each new certainty strengthens a web of unresolved assumptions, and untangling it becomes increasingly difficult. Socrates encountered this situation as the main barrier to wisdom. The criterion of the refutation method is simple and strict. An effective elenchus reveals internal inconsistency in utterances and requires the speaker to formulate the concept precisely. Here, the decisive importance lies in the sequence of reasoning and the unambiguity of terms. If a logical gap is found in the chain of inferences or terms are used vaguely, the process can be considered successful. An open contradiction shows that the belief does not rest on a solid foundation. Working by such a criterion requires readiness to answer questions and to return one's formulations for inspection. Socrates set this standard as a test for any boldly asserted knowledge. The consequences of applying the method show up in various and often unexpected ways. In practice, many beliefs are purified because people are forced to articulate premises and order their reasoning. Moral positions gain clarity when it becomes visible on which assumptions they depend. At the same time, elenchus can lead to a revision of actions. If the sequence of arguments collapses, then the moral basis for an act loses force. Sometimes the technique leads to bewilderment and requires a new look at habitual concepts. Sometimes to a change in behavior. When someone claims that justice is strict retribution, examination will show how that claim relates to the idea of helping those in need, and will reveal hidden contradictions in everyday judgments. Socrates used such shifts as a tool for educating the mind, not as a mere victory in argument. The limits of the method are clear and practical. Elenchus is indicative where the matter concerns concepts and logic. It is weak with respect to empirical facts, where verification relies on observation and experiment, rather than on the sequence of definitions. The method requires time and willingness to honestly reconsider one's words. In the absence of this, it turns into a verbal trap and intensifies conflict. In situations of extreme necessity or where the matter is a professional's technical skill, striving to analyze every assumption is unrealistic. Elenchus does not replace expert experience and does not provide an immediate practical solution under pressure. Socrates knew the limits of the method and most often insisted on it where language and logic remain the main instruments of seeking truth. However, it is more important not only to apply Socratic techniques, but to reproduce his spirit, respect for ignorance, and readiness for joint search. Genuine elenchus requires not a desire to refute an interlocutor at any cost, but the skill to listen, ask leading questions, and accept the results of inquiry. Dialogue in this form ceases to be a weapon and becomes an instrument of mutual enlightenment. In the modern public sphere, the Socratic practice could serve as an antidote to political polarization and informational bubbles. Citizens accustomed to formulating and analyzing their own assumptions are less likely to fall for manipulations based on ambiguity of terms or emotional slogans. In educational institutions, developing the ability to ask and check concepts is more important than mechanically memorizing conclusions. It lays the groundwork for making reasoned decisions and critically evaluating sources. One must also remember moral responsibility. Elenchus frees one from dogmatism, but does not absolve from the obligation to act. Often the demand for clarity leads to theory and practice diverging, and then the moment of choice comes. To change behavior, to revise like. Maiotics is arranged as a sequence of questions that do not so much extract an answer as draw it out from the interlocutor. The facilitator frames the problem as a doubt, then asks for a definition or a reason, after which they carefully return the formulation back, forcing it to pass through the test of clarifications and counterexamples. Each clarification narrows the meaning of words. Each attempt to explain prompts the disclosure of hidden assumptions. An important stage is the demand for a clear formulation. If a concept is vague, it is clarified by specifying features. Then, the internal consistency of the obtained features is checked against one another. As a result, the interlocutor forms a coherent system of reasoning in which conclusions are based on their own, freshly revealed grounds. The key to the mechanism is sequence and stepping back. This is not a casual spoken exchange, but methodical work to give birth to thought. Socrates used this technique because he believed that true knowledge is not handed down from outside as a commodity, but is revealed from within, like a fruit that must be carefully brought into the light. Maurix is needed so that knowledge becomes personal. When you yourself voice and align each premise, readiness to take responsibility for your judgments becomes natural. This turns understanding into a practical support for actions. If a belief arose inside you and withstood the test of questions, you bear responsibility for its consequences. Socrates connected morality with understanding, and Maurix serves as a bridge between thought and action, turning abstract formulas into concrete principles of behavior. Ask yourself why someone spends time on such meticulous work with words. The answer is that quick, ready-made formulas easily lose touch with what they denote. Maurix restores that connection. It does not replace learning skills and facts, but ensures that facts and knowledge become meaningful and manageable in your life. Where the process breaks, it is immediately visible. The method fails when there is no desire to face the truth. If the interlocutor evades precise formulations or periodically uses vague turns of phrase, the examination gets stuck at the level of form and does not reach the essence. Maurix also cannot cope with situations where knowledge is motor skill or empirical mastery. Assembling furniture from instructions or performing heart surgery cannot be achieved only through sequential questions about concepts. Maurix is defeated when questions become a tool for planting someone else's answers. The danger arises if the facilitator already knows the conclusion they want to lead the interlocutor to, and selects questions so that the answer is imposed. In such cases, the knowledge that is born will be counterfeit. Outwardly, it looks like one's own, but inside it remains hollow, unable to withstand testing in new circumstances. Socrates warned against such a transformation of the method into rhetoric, because true Maurix requires honesty and impartiality on the part of the one who leads. Another limit is connected with emotions and power relations. Under conditions of fear, public humiliation, or pressure from authorities, people tend to conform to expectations rather than explore their beliefs. Maurix requires a safe space and a readiness to revise. Without such conditions, the process turns into an imitation of reflection rather than the birth of understanding. My conclusion is this. Maurix is a technically structured way to bring thought to consciousness through demands for clarity, consistency, and responsibility. It is necessary when the goal is not merely to have an opinion, but to live in accordance with it. Where honesty, freedom, and orientation toward meaning are absent, the method breaks down or loses its point. Socrates invested in Maurix not only an instrument for reasoning, but an ethical stance. The knowledge that is born should change life. If questions do not lead to changes, they should be reconsidered, along with the one who asks them. Why did Socrates speak ironically, as if portraying a simple-minded ignoramus, when he could have straightforwardly presented arguments and dissected others' beliefs? You feel this device as an invitation. The question sounds gentle, almost naive, and a detailed explanation is produced in reply. In that naivety lies a methodological trick. Irony works like a doorbell that makes a person open their inner door and expose their convictions to the light. Irony takes on the role of a mediator between equal hierarchies of knowledge. External modesty operates as a context where the demand to provide a definition sounds not like a challenge, but as a request to share one's thought. Such a move dismantles defensive positions and shifts the conversation into the register of inquiry. Socrates used this device alongside Maieuticks. Feigned ignorance directed the interlocutor to formulate, and then a careful analysis of those formulations followed, their internal connections and weak spots. The mechanics are simple and subtle at once. When you answer an apparently simple question, the process forces you to clarify terms, note conditions, and state hidden assumptions. The answer ceases to be an impulsive reaction and becomes a chain of reasoning that is easy to check for contradictions. Then Elenchus kicks in, the sequential identification of inconsistencies. Thus, a tension of thought arises that does not suppress the interlocutor, but forces them to take responsibility for their words and the consequences that follow from them. The result is not a demonstration of superiority, but a transformation of the attitude to knowledge. Irony creates a situation where knowledge appears as a conclusion that a person can accept on their own grounds. An important consequence of this device is that the formation of a conviction is accompanied by a readiness to defend and revise it. When knowledge is born in this way, it becomes an internal guide for actions, not merely a mask for persuading others. The ethical aspect of irony is rarely noticeable at first glance. Here, the matter is a restrained provocation, to call someone to account without public humiliation, to prompt self-examination instead of rhetorical pressure. Socrates combined irony with strict logical honesty. Word by word the meaning was tested, not the effect of speech. It is precisely in this combination that irony turns into an instrument of moral inquiry, not a tactic for theatrical victory in argument. The boundary of the method is clear. If irony becomes a means of mockery, if the listener feels shame instead of an invitation to analysis, the effect is lost. In situations of obvious inequality of power or fear, feigned simplicity turns into pressure. Where the culture of communication does not read subtle signals of self-irony, the device is easily taken for manipulation. Socratic irony requires responsibility from the one who uses it and readiness of the interlocutor for sincere inquiry. Without these conditions, the device loses its ethical force and turns into the rhetoric it originally called into question. Why did Socrates speak ironically, as if portraying a simple-minded ignoramus, when he could have straightforwardly presented arguments and dissected others' beliefs? You feel this device as an invitation. The question sounds gentle, almost naive, and a detailed explanation is produced in reply. In that naivety lies a methodological trick. Irony works like a doorbell that makes a person open their inner door and expose their convictions to the light. Irony takes on the role of a mediator between equal hierarchies of knowledge. External modesty operates as a context where the demand to provide a definition sounds not like a challenge, but as a request to share one's thought. Such a move dismantles defensive positions and shifts the conversation into the register of inquiry. Socrates used this device alongside Maieuticks. Feigned ignorance directed the interlocutor to formulate, and then a careful analysis of those formulations followed, their internal connections and weak spots. The mechanics are simple and subtle at once. When you answer an apparently simple question, the process forces you to clarify terms, note conditions, and state hidden assumptions. The answer ceases to be an impulsive reaction and becomes a chain of reasoning that is easy to check for contradictions. Then Elenchus kicks in, the sequential identification of inconsistencies. Thus a tension of thought arises that does not suppress the interlocutor, but forces them to take responsibility for their words and the consequences that follow from them. The result is not a demonstration of superiority, but a transformation of the attitude to knowledge. Irony creates a situation where knowledge appears as a conclusion that a person can accept on their own grounds. An important consequence of this device is that the formation of a conviction is accompanied by a readiness to defend and revise it. When knowledge is born in this way, it becomes an internal guide for actions, not merely a mask for persuading others. When knowledge is born in this way, it becomes an inner guide for action, not merely a mask for persuading others. The ethical aspect of irony is rarely apparent at first glance. This is about restrained provocation, to elicit a response without public humiliation, to prompt self-examination instead of rhetorical pressure. Socratic irony was combined with strict logical honesty. Meaning was examined word by word, not the effect of speech. It is precisely in this combination that irony becomes an instrument of moral inquiry, not a device for theatrical victory in argument. The boundary of the method is clear. If irony becomes a means of mockery, if the listener feels shame instead of an invitation to analysis, the effect is lost. In conditions of obvious power inequality or fear, feigned simplicity turns into coercion. Where a communication culture does not read subtle signals of self-irony, the device is easily taken for manipulation. Socratic irony requires responsibility on the part of the user and a readiness on the part of the interlocutor for sincere inquiry. Without these conditions, the device loses its ethical force and becomes the rhetoric it initially called into question. The practice of such a device requires skill and empathy. In dialogue, it is important not merely to ask contrived, simple questions, but to listen carefully to the answers, note difficulties, and encourage clarifications. It is useful to accompany irony with an explicit signal of goodwill. A gentle smile, a respectful tone, a readiness to acknowledge one's own gaps. In pedagogy, the method is effective when the teacher does not seek to win the argument, but organizes a process of joint discovery. In therapy, when the therapist helps the client become aware of contradictions in their narrative without imposing interpretations. In public debate, the device is fragile. On social networks and before large audiences, irony is easily perceived as mockery and amplifies polarization. Therefore, the key criterion is not only the skill of asking questions, but responsibility for the consequences. Socratic irony is the art of turning doubt into a learning opportunity, requiring spiritual maturity and ethical sensitivity. To learn it is to learn to respect another's thought and to care that the search for truth remain a shared endeavor, not a weapon. Practice makes irony honest. Seek dialogue, not triumph. If one admits that virtue is knowledge, the consequence becomes strict. Moral mistakes cease to be mysteries of character and turn into problems of intellect. Then, correcting behavior requires not only training willpower, but also changing the content of beliefs. Such a consequence alters the practice of upbringing and punishment. The educational task becomes a task of clarifying what is truly valuable. The reason for this consequence lies in a simple observation about how we act. Actions follow from what we regard as good and what we think should be avoided. When you are convinced that some advantage is more important than justice, you will choose it. When the conception of the good is skewed or vague, decisions become erroneous. Socrates started from the idea that knowledge directs desire. To understand what is truly good is to begin to act differently. Clarification requires talking about what is meant by knowledge. It is not merely a set of facts that can be parroted from memory. It is about deep discrimination, the ability to formulate concepts, see their boundaries and connections, and apply them in concrete situations. There is declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and self-knowledge. Virtuous knowledge includes the ability to determine what justice means in a given case, and the ability to compare that with the motives that drive action. The Socratic emphasis falls on clarity of definition. He demanded that a concept cease to be mere word and become a criterion for choice. A brief example for you. Imagine a person who is certain that honesty will lead to a short-term loss. His understanding of benefit directly affects his choice. If that person suddenly learns that honesty creates trust and opens long-term opportunities, behavior will change by itself. This illustrates how a change in the content of knowledge brings a change in actions. It is useful to analyze the structure of this knowledge element by element. The cause of errors is false premises that place wrong ends and means under us. The structure of correction includes clarifying terms, analyzing the consequences of beliefs, and reconfiguring motivation on new grounds. The consequences of such an approach are visible in two areas. Methodological, where upbringing becomes a question of teaching reasoning rather than simple habituation, and practical, where moral responsibility acquires an intellectual foundation. The limits of the approach are also clear. Knowledge may require time and conditions for assimilation, and external coercion can impede the realization, even of decisions, that a person recognizes as reasonable. The tie to a historical position remains specific. Socrates held that one who truly knows how to act will not act against that knowledge. Socrates systematically sought definitions and tested them until they became working tools for choice. For you, this means the following. To work on virtue, you must clarify beliefs and constantly test the logic of your arguments. Socrates shows that ethical literacy begins with the willingness to name what exactly you consider good, and then align desires with that understanding. If you follow this path, care for yourself and responsibility toward others gain a firm intellectual basis, and morality ceases to be merely a set of rules. This does not mean that knowledge by itself solves all problems. Emotions, habits, and social circumstances continue to play a role. But knowledge makes conscious intervention in these mechanisms possible. The practice of clarifying and rethinking beliefs requires dialogue with yourself and with others, and discipline of thought. In the end, the goal is not only correctness of judgments, but the formation of character, in which reason and will act in concert. Such an approach turns ethics from a set of prescriptions into an art of living consciously. It is a path of continual self-enlightenment, not a one-time conviction, but a habit of critically testing motives, revising goals, and learning to link words with deeds. It also requires humility and the readiness to learn. Take a particular case in reasoning about virtues. Courage is considered the ability to endure danger. But without the criterion of justice and the reason that directs action. When courage is detached from an understanding of ends and becomes merely a technique of reacting to threat, behavior easily loses its bearings. Socrates paid attention precisely to such cases, when one quality is isolated and begins to live by its own logic, outside connection with other moral bearings. This is not a dramatic scenario, but a thought fragment that shows how an isolated ability can exist formally while lacking moral content. The generalization follows from the definition of virtue as knowledge of the good and the ability to align that knowledge with action. If every moral quality is a way of discerning and acting for the sake of the good, then they turn out to be parts of a single structure of understanding. Justice sets the measure of relations to other people. Prudence establishes the scale of goals. Moderation regulates the attitude toward pleasures. Courage ensures the execution of decisions. Socrates linked the integrity of the person with the fact that different knowledges of the good harmonize desires and choices. When concepts are clear, capacities do not conflict, because all are directed toward one meaning, the recognition of what is truly valuable. The reason for unity is simple. Any virtue has the common function of orienting the will toward the good. The structure of this interconnection is expressed through the concepts on which moral judgment rests. The concept of justice resonates with prudence, because an action that is just in word requires an assessment of context and consequences. The consequences of this structure are obvious. If education is limited to passing on separate skills, the person remains fragmented and prone to goal conflicts. The Socratic idea of clear definitions turns moral qualities into a mutually permeable network of knowledge, where a change in one link is reflected in the whole system. A short, practical conclusion. Working on one virtue means simultaneously influencing others. Education is not accumulation of disparate habits, but clarification of what is considered good and why. I say this because I have seen people, having clarified one concept, suddenly reconfigure their motivations and behavior. Socrates proposed the method of dialogue and self-examination precisely to uncover such inner connections and make them working instruments of choice. The limitations of the general formula must be considered directly. In a number of practical situations, virtues appear divisible for reasons of external pressure, immaturity, and partial knowledge. Social roles sometimes require displays that look like one virtue without the full set of accompanying qualities. Emotional and bodily limitations hinder the immediate embodiment of understanding in action. In conditions of insufficient information or conflict between values, it is useful to acknowledge that integration takes time and requires certain conditions. This means that the unity of virtues functions as a normative goal to be striven for through education of the mind and characteristic practices, not as an instantly attainable given. For you, the conclusion is simple. Setting yourself the task of connecting concepts rather than practicing isolated reactions means building moral integrity. The inviting character of Socrates emphasizes that work on oneself requires constant clarification of motives and concepts. Socrates shows that the unity of the virtues is not an abstract ideal, but a practical program. Learn to see connections, align desires with what is truly good, and gradually integrate this understanding into everyday decisions. If you act this way, changes will be deeper and more durable than simple training of separate traits. Socrates asserted a simple rule. Any action that contradicts your reasoned view of what is good does not come from weak will, but from ignorance. If a person acts against their better judgment, the cause lies in their not possessing at that moment the necessary knowledge about the good or about consequences, not in the weakening of their spirit. This rule changes the view of errors. Errors turn out not to be a manifestation of moral frustration, but a cognitive problem. Then the task becomes diagnostic, to find out exactly where the lack of knowledge is. In the very concept of the good, in the relation of causes and effects, or in practical skills linking judgment to action. How to explain cases when a person clearly says they consider an action harmful but still does it. People will often cite emotions, habits, peer pressure, and bodily impulses. These factors influence behavior by distorting the representation of what now seems best. If any passion is perceived as a short-term good, reason loses its foothold. Situations where decisions are made under the pressure of the moment show that the criteria for evaluating the good are poorly anchored within the person. A man who knows about the harms of smoking and smokes every evening after dinner illustrates this phenomenon. The representation of short-term relief outweighs the representation of long-term good, because the criteria of the good are in conflict and have not been translated into the practical knowledge that regulates behavior. Body and emotions act as interpreters of the world. Then, the source of error is the incorrect representation of values at a given moment. If pleasure is perceived as an absolute value, or a threat seems more significant than it is, choice is formed under the influence of a distorted picture of the good. Socrates insisted that understanding the true value changes motivation. Knowledge of the good rearranges preferences so that the desirable and the reasonable coincide. The cause is ignorance. The structure consists in how an erroneous evaluation becomes the engine of choice. The consequences are visible in persistent repetitions of wrong actions. When a person cannot clearly determine what the good is in a given situation, they orient themselves by immediate sensations or habitual reactions. This structure explains why dialogue and clarification of concepts prove effective. They work on the source of distortion, not only on its manifestations. The Socratic solution rests on clarification of concepts and on systematic testing of beliefs. Dialogue reveals inner contradictions, forces comparison of what you believe with how you act. After such clarification, a practical knowledge arises, not an abstract formula, but a clear understanding of what is worth enduring, what will bring harm, and where illusions lie. Socrates used leading questions to make knowledge explicit and thereby change motivation. For you, this looks simple. When you notice a repeated action that undermines your goals, do not be angry with yourself and do not look for willpower. Ask what representations of the good govern this action. Try to formulate concepts precisely. Break the immediate "I want" into conclusions about the future. Speak the consequences out loud. A dialogue with yourself or with another person will clarify where knowledge is lacking and give a chance to turn understanding into stable practice. There are limits to this approach. Physical illnesses, neurochemical imbalances, and extreme external conditions sometimes make it difficult to embody knowledge in action. Sometimes time, training, and support are required for new understanding to become stable in life. Socrates did not promise instant miracles. He offered a method that changes motivations through clarification of thought and thereby reduces the frequency and scale of moral errors. External successes are measured by visible signs: wealth, fame, power. The inner world is assessed differently, by the stability of convictions, purity of motives, the ability to live in accordance with what you consider true. Socrates placed the second set at the center. Care for the soul is more important than public devices and external victories. Care for the soul in Socrates covers several interrelated tasks. First, it is a clear understanding of what the good is and which aims are truly worth pursuing. Second, It is the constant supervision of one's own motives and habits, so that desires do not replace judgment. Third, it is a readiness to correct oneself on the basis of reason, not out of tradition or majority opinion. Such a view turns philosophy into a practice of life, where thought serves the cultivation of character. What does this mean in practice for you and me? It is not a formal ceremony of moral self-condemnation. It is methodical self-enlightenment. Inner work requires questions that expose inconsistencies between what you believe and how you act. Socrates' maieutic approach is the skill of bringing to light the ideas that drive actions and testing them for coherence. Constant clarification of concepts makes desires manageable, because substitutions and illusions disappear when you become precise in words and concepts. The mechanics of this care are simple in words and hard in execution. The cause of violations is unclarified representations of the good. The structure of the process consists in concepts forming a scale of priorities, which then directs habits and choices. The consequence is obvious. If the scale is shifted, behavior adapts to short-term stimuli. Socrates believed that changing the scale through reflection and argument rearranges motivation so that the long-term good becomes preferable to fleeting satisfaction. At the same time, there are limits to what soul care can provide. Individual work on beliefs does not eliminate structural injustice and does not replace political responsibility. Biological limitations and harsh circumstances complicate the embodiment of ideals in action. Sometimes, help and social changes are required for philosophical clarity to have a chance to manifest. Nevertheless, inner discipline remains a support. It helps make decisions even in harsh conditions, translating aspirations into manageable behavior. For everyday practice, a simple rule is enough. Watch what representations of the good underlie your decisions. Ask yourself questions that clarify motivation. Develop the habit of discussing beliefs aloud or with another person to see weak points in your reasoning. The accumulation of such clarifications turns into moral knowledge that acts like a skill, not abstract, but practical. Socrates proposed philosophy as care, not as a luxury of the mind. If you accept this, life will cease to be a sum of external indicators and will become a process of continually putting yourself in order. Care for the soul is an everyday discipline, requiring honesty and patience. But it is precisely it that makes it possible to live according to what you truly consider valuable. Socrates left the idea that a person's main task is to attend to the soul. Keep it as your orienting point, and choices will begin to conform to understanding rather than chance. External successes are measured by visible signs: wealth, fame, power. The inner world is assessed differently, by the stability of convictions, purity of motives, the ability to live in accordance with what you consider true. Socrates placed the second set at the center. Care for the soul is more important than public devices and external victories. Care for the soul in Socrates covers several interrelated tasks. First, it is a clear understanding of what the good is and which aims are truly worth pursuing. Second, it is the constant supervision of one's own motives and habits, so that desires do not replace judgment. Third, it is a readiness to correct oneself on the basis of reason, not out of tradition or majority opinion. Such a view turns philosophy into a practice of life, where a thought serves the cultivation of character. What does this mean in practice for you and me? It is not a formal ceremony of moral self-condemnation. It is methodical self-enlightenment. Inner work requires questions that expose inconsistencies between what you believe and how you act. Socrates' maieutic approach is the skill of bringing to light the ideas that drive actions and testing them for coherence. Constant clarification of concepts makes desires manageable because substitutions and illusions disappear when you become precise in words and concepts. The mechanics of this care are simple in words and hard in execution. The cause of violations is unclarified representations of the good. The structure of the process consists in concepts forming a scale of priorities, which then directs habits and choices. The consequence is obvious. If the scale is shifted, behavior adapts to short-term stimuli. Socrates believed that changing the scale through reflection and argument rearranges motivation so that the long-term good becomes preferable to fleeting satisfaction. At the same time, there are limits to what soul care can provide. Individual work on beliefs does not eliminate structural injustice and does not replace political responsibility. Biological limitations and harsh circumstances complicate the embodiment of ideals in action. Sometimes help and social changes are required for philosophical clarity to have a chance to manifest. Nevertheless, inner discipline remains a support. It helps make decisions even in harsh conditions, translating aspirations into manageable behavior. For everyday practice, a simple rule is enough. Watch what representations of the good underlie your decisions. Ask yourself questions that clarify motivation. Develop the habit of discussing beliefs aloud or with another person to see weak points in your reasoning. The accumulation of such clarifications turns into moral knowledge that acts like a skill, not abstract but practical. Socrates proposed philosophy as care, not as a luxury of the mind. If you accept this, life will cease to be a sum of external indicators and will become a process of continually putting yourself in order. Care of the soul is an everyday discipline that requires honesty and patience, but it is precisely this care that makes it possible to live according to what you truly value. Socrates left behind the idea that a person's main task is to attend to the soul. Keep it as a guide, and choices will begin to be governed by understanding rather than chance. This does not demand that you renounce the world, but offers a different way of being present in it. Act consciously, notice your reactions, and return to principles when goals grow diffuse. Practices can be simple: a decisions diary, a short daily inventory of motives, an honest conversation with a friend or mentor. Regularity matters. Philosophy as a skill grows through repetition, not through episodic impulses. Finally, do not forget self-compassion. This is work that requires acknowledging mistakes and being willing to forgive your own slips. Without kindness toward yourself, self-examination will turn into self-flagellation. Let philosophical honesty go hand in hand with patience and gentleness. This gentleness does not negate the rigor of reason, it softens it further. Definitions keep thought in working order. If you want to sort out what good, justice, honor mean, you first need to grasp the word and look at its parts. A formulated concept becomes a tool. It gives direction to reasoning, crosses out the inessential, and allows you to compare arguments according to rules rather than intuition. Socrates demanded explicit formulations because, without them, conversation slides along the surface and loses its footing. Next, the reason for that demand matters. When a concept remains vague, you tend to mix several different things under one name and mistakenly turn practice into habit. I see how the precision of a definition immediately shows where arguments collapse. Words become tests of coherence. A definition sets criteria for judging actions and motives. It turns a moral dispute into a problem that can be solved or clarified, not an endless exchange of opinions. For the faculty of reason, this is an economy of energy and an increase in the accuracy of choice. Imagine a concept as a map. A map is not the territory itself, but it allows you to move through it without constant wandering. When the map is clear, the traps of misunderstanding disappear. The map image helps to see another important function. A definition filters attention. You begin to notice those aspects of a situation that correspond to the term and ignore those that do not fall within its frame. This makes reasoning more manageable, but at the same time requires flexibility in switching maps if the terrain unexpectedly changes. There are limits to this technique. The reason for the difficulty lies in language and experience. Some concepts live in practice and elude strict formulae. The structure of the problem is this. Attempts to fix meaning rigidly sometimes miss context and lead to false confidence. Consequences vary, from stalling a discussion when the dispute reduces to a quarrel over words, to turning a definition into a dogma that closes off further inquiry. Clearly, a definition does not solve all questions. It structures thought, but does not guarantee truth where bodily, emotional, or historical factors are heavily involved. The connection with what Socrates did lies directly in the method. He insisted that his interlocutor formulate what he considered important, and then subjected that formula to testing. This was not an academic game, but a way of tending the mind. To break a concept into constituent parts, see contradictions, and adjust the scale of values. Socrates showed that philosophy requires words that can be analyzed and brought under argument. If you make it a habit to give yourself clear definitions, you give yourself the chance to act consistently and to be accountable for your beliefs. Finish like this. Work with concepts as tools that require periodic tuning. Try to formulate your key terms before making a decision. This is not a paper formality, but a discipline of thinking that returns control over motives and actions to you. Socrates taught this, and if you begin truly to call things by their names, care of the soul will become more manageable and less dependent on random impressions. But be careful. A definition is a tool, not a goal. Sometimes practical wisdom moves faster. You understand how to act in a concrete situation without formulating everything down to the last detail. In such cases, it is useful to return to the definitions retrospectively. Check whether your intuition matches what you would have described in words. If it does not match, that is a reason to revise both. Another practice is to keep several working definitions at hand and switch them experimentally. This way, you will see which description better predicts the outcome. Finally, keep definitions alive. Update them with experience. Explain them with simple examples, and listen to how they work in practice. Then concepts will cease to be a waste of time and will become reliable allies of your reason. Remember, precise words ease responsibility. You see what you are accountable for and can correct mistakes before they turn into habit. Many accept moral decisions as a set of instructions from outside. You do what is customary in your circle. Repeat the formulations of authorities. Orient yourself by law or by what is advantageous in the current situation. The problem is that actions remain superficial when there is no independent reasoning behind them. Motivation loses connection with understanding. Deeds become skillful role-playing. Socrates saw this as a threat to the soul. It becomes meaningless if choices are made out of habit or under pressure. The criterion of autonomy is formulated simply. A decision deserves to be called autonomous when it is based on one's own analysis of the grounds for the action, the readiness to take responsibility, and the ability to justify the choice rationally. Coherence of reasoning is important. It serves as a measure of authenticity. If you can explain why you consider an action right and agree to be accountable for its consequences, that is already a sign of autonomy. Socrates demanded definitions not for the sake of winning an argument, but for this very coherence, to know what you are responsible for. The consequences of establishing such a criterion for individual life are profound. Autonomous choice strengthens inner consistency and reduces internal division. You feel less guilt and offer fewer excuses to yourself. In the public sphere, autonomy raises the quality of discourse. Arguments become more important than status and rhetoric. Conversations cease to be manipulative. If people learn to hold each other accountable not by tone and number of supporters, but by the content of arguments, the chance of mass errors and moral panics decreases. Socrates believed that responsibility of consciousness is not an abstract demand, but a practical condition of a worthy life. Imagine a short picture. A person chooses to tell the truth where it will harm his popularity, because he can explain why truth matters more. This is an example of an action falling under the criterion of autonomy. The moment of choice is simple, but the criterion is visible immediately. Justification and readiness to take responsibility. Lack of autonomy brings other consequences as well. When you cannot justify your choice, decisions become vulnerable to external influences and are easily manipulated. Such a state favors rhetoric as a substitute for reasoning. The ability to speak well becomes valued above the honesty of the argument. Socrates criticized this tendency. For him, speech should serve clarification, not cover up emptiness. Where autonomy is weak, morality becomes a set of conventions, and responsibility disperses among roles and the voices of the majority. At the same time, autonomy has clear limits. Since it relies on reason and information, its effectiveness is limited by the level of knowledge and experience. In narrowly technical or urgent situations, the demand for full independent justification may be unrealistic. One must rely on trust in experts, on institutions that accumulate knowledge. Autonomy does not absolve you from recognizing your own limitations and seeking competent help. Moreover, social obligations and legal frameworks impose their own conditions. An autonomous decision always passes through consequences in the world of other people and institutions, which do not disappear because of internal coherence. The boundary of autonomy is also connected to emotional and cognitive preparation. Reason requires training. The capacity to keep oneself in moral dialogue is developed through practice and upbringing. Socrates offered a method that supported such practice. Constant questioning and testing of beliefs make autonomy more resilient. However, the method itself guarantees nothing if a minimal set of facts and reasoning skills is absent. Autonomy is a demand on a person, but not a magic formula that removes the consequences of errors under conditions of information shortage. If you want to take responsibility for your beliefs, start small. Formulate the grounds, be ready to discuss them, and acknowledge the limits of your knowledge. This is not a declaration of independence from society. It is a way to be honest with yourself and with others. Socrates showed that moral autonomy is not isolation, but a discipline of thought that makes you capable of living in responsibility before your own soul and those who share the world with you. The mechanism I'm talking about turns words into a tool for testing thought. Speech in this sense is not ornament, but a sequence of questions and definitions that build a coherent picture and reveal internal contradictions. At the center stands the demand for clear definition. Before asserting, you must clarify what exactly you mean. Questions serve not to trap an opponent, but to locate points of uncertainty. The evaluation of an argument is built on a set of simple procedures: coherence of premises, following of the conclusion, checking practical consequences. And it is these procedures that make speech a working tool of thought. Socrates applied this set of actions as a regular practice, structuring conversation so that it could show where theory cuts against reality. A short conclusion. The mechanism makes speech a means of clarification, not only a means of impression. Why it is needed? If you want to be responsible for your decisions, you need a procedure that checks assertions before they become the basis for action. Speech organized as a sequential method helps to tie belief to reasons, not to habits or fear of losing status. It trains the ability to hold the subject in the reflective plane until its logic and practical price become clear. For the public sphere, such an order proves vital. When public discourse rests on arguments, it is easier to relate a decision to its consequences and to understand who bears what responsibility. Socrates proposed seeing dialogue as a discipline of the soul that relies on verbal testing and makes a person less vulnerable to empty promises. A question for you. Where does this mechanism break most often? The causes of breakdown can be brought into a single picture. The first thing that destroys the discipline of speech is goal distortion. When the goal of conversation ceases to be clarification and becomes impression, an environment forms that values presentation technique more than content. The second, institutional incentives. Systems reward victory in debates and the loud voice, and these incentives crowd out careful reasoning. The third, cognitive vulnerabilities. Confirmation bias, emotional hotspots, and group dynamics create fertile ground for rhetorical tricks. Together, these causes work like a vicious circle in which mastery of persuasion replaces the skill of explanation. The structure of the breakdown looks like this. Rhetoric becomes dominant when the external effect of speech is valued higher than its internal coherence. This manifests in several mechanisms at once. Choosing arguments for the audience instead of the truth. Replacing clear definitions with figurative formulas. Focusing on emotion sympathy links instead of checking basic assumptions. Consequences are predictable. The capacity to publicly justify decisions decreases. Tendency towards superficial consensuses grows. Personal responsibility for words weakens. Socrates believed that such deformation is ruinous for the soul, because speech ceases to be a means of knowledge and becomes a technique of social advancement. Where the mechanism breaks, there are also concrete limits to its restoration. Sometimes time, availability of facts, and urgency make full checking impossible. Sometimes the level of preparation of the audience or the speaker does not allow maintaining strict definitional discipline. Sometimes power is organized so that truthful clarification is punished or marginalized. Acknowledging these limits does not mean abandoning the practice of speech, but relating it to real conditions. Socrates showed that the demand for clarity must be cultivated, but it requires an environment and habits that are created gradually. The takeaway for you is clear. If you want words to serve your responsibility, develop the habit of first asking questions and clarifying concepts, then checking the coherence of the inference, and only after that formulating a belief. This is a discipline that protects the soul from the effects of superficial persuasiveness and gives you support when making decisions. I believe that following this principle makes public discourse more resilient and makes you less dependent on external manipulation, just as Socrates proposed in his practice of seeking clarity. How to measure a person's moral competence and how the ability to reason about the good differs from the habit of following rules? Ask yourself this question directly. Can you explain why you act one way or another and connect the explanation to concepts that withstand the test of speech? Moral intelligence is not a set of reactions to stimuli and not simply knowledge of prescriptions. It is the ability to hold the reasons for your actions in mind, formulate them clearly, and subject them to doubt where you see grounds for doubt. If you want to understand what it means to raise such a person, start with the question of which practices form the capacity to think about the good. Moral intelligence looks like a combination of three abilities. The first, the ability to define precisely what you mean by good, just, kind. The second, the capacity to build causal links between concepts and actions so that conclusions follow from premises. The third, the readiness to subject your own motives to scrutiny and, if necessary, change them. Socrates thought that without clear definitions, reasoning turns into a set of baseless assertions. Maieutic helps to bring concepts into being within a person. Elenchus cleanses them of contradictions. And then, knowledge becomes a source of moral behavior. This trinity, definition, logical coherence, readiness for self-correction, is what I call moral intelligence. Why school often does not provide this capacity, how it can help, and where its resources are limited. The reason for the deficit is that formal assessment systems measure mastery of rules and facts, not the ability for critical self-examination. The structure of education can be changed so that it stimulates the practice of reasoning. Regular exercises in formulation, dialogical work, assignments that require justification of actions, training in checking motivations. The consequences of such education appear on two levels. On the internal level, a person learns to care for himself as the bearer of beliefs and acts consciously. On the public level, the arguments that underpin collective decisions become more transparent and accountable. Essentially, Socrates proposed transforming educational practice from transferring recipes into forming the ability to think about the good, and this change affects both personal responsibility and the quality of public decisions. The limits of what education can do must also be acknowledged. Formal schooling cannot replace personal practice of self-correction and care of the soul required by everyday choice. The educational environment can sow the habit of asking questions, but maintaining it must be up to the person in the circumstances of life. Sometimes, social institutions reward conformity and demonstrative certainty, and these incentives negate the best methods. I believe that if you want to develop moral intelligence, it is important to make a habit of editing your beliefs. As Socrates suggested, keep concepts at hand, check inferences, and listen to the inner monitor at the moment of choice. Education can provide the tool and space for practice, and then responsibility transfers to you. Practice begins with small things. Record an account of your motives after an important choice. Discuss it with a mentor. Look for counter-arguments and note what changed in your reasoning. Model scenarios help to try on another's position and see which principles are resilient and which are mere habit. Emotions should not be suppressed, but tracked. A delay in response creates space for checking the grounds. Community amplifies the effect when honest feedback and stable rituals of accountability are present. The example of a mentor who combines conviction with willingness to doubt is more valuable than 100 lectures. As a result, what forms is not so much rule following as the ability to formulate reasons for actions, evaluate them, and change habits in light of arguments. This work requires time, honesty with oneself, and community support. Reflection, exchange of arguments, and readiness to change make moral intelligence live and resilient. The consequence is noticeable and almost bodily. If you have learned to hear the inner signal and respect it, your behavior becomes predictably mature, and many urgent mistakes simply are not made. Such foresight does not remove the complexity of choice, but it spares you from hasty steps that you would later have to correct. It is about life acquiring a different tempo. Before moving, you pause for a millisecond, and that little pause is often enough for reason to switch on and offer arguments for or against. The reason for this effect lies in the combination of several internal mechanisms. The inner sign is formed from accumulated experience, habits of attentiveness, and the skill of intersocial checking of motives. Emotional memory signals past mistakes, and cognitive capacity for reflection assesses their relevance now. This assemblage acts as a safeguard. It does not dictate decisions, but raises a hypothesis in the form of a slight doubt that requires a brief check. From this follows a simple thought. If you want to develop such a signal, you must train not the voice, but the capacities that create it. Reflection, attentiveness to motivation, and flexibility in evaluating your own reasons. Why some people hear this voice clearly, while others hardly notice anything? This question points to a combination of upbringing and practice. Look at the habits of your environment and how doubts were treated in childhood. Were questions about motives encouraged, or was obedience demanded? Analysis reveals three sources of differences. The first source, behavioral models that we adopt. The second, the frequency and quality of self-analysis. The third, social incentives that either amplify attentiveness or drown it out with the loudness of confident assertions. Development of each of these sources is amenable to practice. The model is explained like this. When it is customary in the environment to stop and ask why, the brain learns to associate a pause with safety and usefulness. The habit of self-analysis is built from simple exercises: formulating motives, recording reasons, and checking their logic. The consequences of regular training are visible in small things. You less often make promises under pressure, more often check the factors that truly matter, and become less dependent on external applause. A short example. Before agreeing to a request, you write down 3 reasons why, and one of them makes you postpone the answer, and this prevents a mistake. A clarification is needed about the limits of trust in this voice. It does not claim absolute truth and does not replace reason. Its task is to mobilize rational scrutiny or draw attention to what you usually disregard. Sometimes it acts like residual fear or as a trace of habitual guilt, and then it requires not blind confidence but criticism. It is important to remember that the inner warning sign proves most reliable in situations where you already have experience and where emotions do not overwhelm the ability to assess information. The connection to Socrates here is direct and substantial. Socrates spoke of the daimonion as an inner foreboding that sometimes deterred him from a particular step. For him, this sign was part of a moral mechanism. He did not accept it as a substitute for dialectical work, but as a safeguard that made one pause and begin verification. In my view, Socrates used this inner voice as the very pause I spoke of, not as a guide to a sudden decision, but as an invitation to reasoning. If you practice attentiveness and examine your motivations, that voice will become a reliable companion in choices, not merely a random feeling of anxiety. One day you notice how public opinion rearranges the order of the day. Lunchtime conversations become arguments. Headlines become justifications for decisions. And a subtle initial uncertainty is buried under the habit of repeating other people's convictions. In this private picture, it is important to see the mechanism, not a drama, but an ordinary technique of forming beliefs. A person who hears assertions loudly and often begins to take them as given, and that sensation grows into a readiness to act. I have seen this in my own observations. Voices already affirmed by the collective acquire the status of justifications, even though their internal logic may remain weak. The conclusion is simple. Public opinion has powerful empirical force. It works as a filter of attention and as a coordinating signal. When many people agree on one formulation, it gains symbolic energy and begins to influence choices, institutions, and habits. Socrates insisted that mass confidence poses a special danger to reason because it masks a lack of argumentation and substitutes verification with repetition. This is not a random reproach, but an observation about how collective solidarity turns opinion into a normative feature of life. Why is mass belief so effective? The reasons lie in the social organization of attention and in the economy of cognitive resources. People tend to trust sources that appear confident, consistent, and numerous. Rhetoric, habitual formulas, and vivid images act as accelerants. Sometimes authorities give theses that are easy to transmit, and this amplifies their spread. The elenchus, Socrates' method, is entirely aimed at dissecting such accelerated formulas. The task is to reveal what the confidence rests on and whether there is argumentative support behind it. For those who want to preserve judgmental autonomy, it is important to recognize the drivers of public opinion and to distinguish them from genuine justifications. Generalization requires attention to structures. Mass beliefs perform three functions. The first function is coordinative. Society needs common representations to act coherently. The second is signaling. Majority opinion indicates what is considered acceptable or safe. The third is cognitive. It serves as a shortcut for decision-making under time constraints. Understanding these functions makes it easier to see when collective confidence brings benefits and when it masks emptiness. Socrates emphasized that knowledge and morality are not determined by the number of supporters, so checking within reason remains key. The limits of skepticism toward public opinion need to be formulated clearly. Above all, one can doubt from two different positions, productive and paralyzing. Productive skepticism requires work. Ask questions, seek definitions, and request grounds. Paralyzing skepticism leads to constant doubt without action, and then collective knowledge, even if partly incomplete, remains the only available tool. Socrates acknowledged the value of public opinion in areas where individual verification is impossible, while demanding moral responsibility for which beliefs are accepted. Finally, the boundaries of practice. Strong skepticism is effective where you have access to arguments and where decisions can be revised. In emergencies, when time is short or verification is absent, reliance on collective opinion is sometimes justified as a temporary strategy. Still, I insist, even in such cases, leave for yourself criteria by which you are willing to accept the majority position. Ask for definitions, clarify the grounds, and demand internal assent to what you are about to do. This brings Socrates' stance into a modern context, to doubt while remaining responsible for your beliefs. If you do this regularly, public opinion will cease to automatically govern your actions and will become one of the data you evaluate, not the only rule. If you say that you know, you take on an obligation. Knowledge entails action. When a belief is treated as knowledge, it ceases to be private comfort and becomes a basis for choice, words, and deeds. This principle lies at the heart of Socratic thought. Socrates linked knowledge with a responsible life, holding that true understanding presupposes readiness to act in accordance with it. I state the principle plainly. You cannot calmly assert a belief and at the same time evade the consequences of its application. But here tension arises. Acknowledging responsibility requires an inner movement that is frightening. One part of you strives for clarity, another clings to habitual excuses because change may cost status, comforts, or relationships. Confrontation with obligation raises questions about the risk of error, the possibility of causing harm, the price of sincerity. Socrates faced this tension. His demand to live in accordance with what one calls knowledge conflicted with social expectations and personal safety. Anxiety and inhibition in taking responsibility are a normal part of the process, not proof of your weakness. The causes of such inhibition are easy to trace. First, many assertions serve people as support for identity and social ties. Second, accepting obligation requires argumentation skills and readiness for self-correction. Third, there is a real cost to public disagreement with established opinions. The structure of this tension is that cognitive economy and social benefits conflict with the moral duty to check and confirm one's judgments. The consequences remain obvious. Either beliefs remain nominal or moral responsibility is born, manifested in changed behavior and a readiness to explain one's reasons. The solution, on the side where reason operates, can also be practical. Start with the habit of demanding definitions from yourself. A clear word reduces the vagueness of obligations. First, formulate what exactly you consider true and why. Second, subject your grounds to criticism. Look for inconsistencies and be ready to correct them. Third, take small actions that align with your beliefs. Action strengthens the correspondence between knowledge and life. These steps are not abstract rules, but working tools to ensure that responsibility does not remain a pretty word on a canvas, but becomes a daily practice. Sustain this process through constant care for your inner state. Periodic checking of beliefs reduces the likelihood of tormented conscience and the stigmatization of doubts. When Socrates led a line of questioning, he aimed not merely to pick a winner in an argument, but to clarify whether the interlocutor was ready to live in accordance with what he termed right. In modern terms, this means public readiness to explain motives and frequent self-examination about what actions follow from your words. I know this requires courage, but it is precisely such constant alignment of thought and deed that makes philosophy a discipline of life, not a theoretical pastime. If you keep this rule in front of your eyes, responsibility for beliefs will cease to be a burden and become a support. Socrates repeatedly returned his interlocutor to the affairs of the soul. Knowledge obliges, and this obligation purifies intentions. Do a few simple things. Speak from clear definitions. Check the grounds. Minimize the distance between word and action. Then, beliefs will become an intelligent link between what you know and who you are. Philosophy often looks like a field of verbal battles, where applause and clever turns of phrase confer special honor on meaning. On the other hand, there is philosophy that lives as a habit of body and mind. Morning questions, a duty to oneself, small corrections in deeds. This contrast matters because it defines an approach to life. If thought remains spectacle, it supplies sharp lines and a keen mind on the stage of argument. If thought becomes habit, it changes how you wake up, how you make decisions, how you sleep. Socrates showed that philosophy is not only the skill of speaking convincingly, but a constant work on the soul, repetitive and demanding patience. Unfolding this idea requires attention to the setup of practice. The reason philosophy turns into habit lies in three interconnected things: the habit of self-questioning, readiness to correct, and the order of daily actions. The method works simply. Every morning, ask yourself a concrete question about the day's aim. Every time, formulate the definition of important words. Every time, check the connection between words and deeds. Socrates taught thus: the question is not for spectacle, but to test readiness to live by what is called true. The mechanism is that repetition makes categories understandable and automatic, and clear definitions shorten the distance between belief and deed. The consequence of this work is visible in that motivations become more transparent and their management moves from the realm of mere feeling into the realm of reason. An example of such a step is simple. Once you decide to speak the truth in small everyday matters, you will find that major decisions are made more easily and without a sudden sense of hypocrisy. Socrates saw how regular conversations about the good became training for real behavior, and the result showed up in the stability of actions. Fixation requires concrete practices you can begin right now. Do 3 things consistently. Formulate the concept you are ready to be accountable for. Check its grounds. Take a small action in accordance with it. These 3 points work like muscle training, at first unhurriedly, then automatically. It is also important to understand the limits of this approach. In an extreme situation, the habit of reasoning is replaced by the need to act quickly, and here philosophical training helps more intuitively than analytically. In conditions of fear or violence, formulas and definitions waste time. But it is precisely the habit of caring for the soul that makes it possible to preserve clarity of intention after the crisis. The limit of the practice appears when the external world demands immediate reaction or when resources are so constrained that reasoning becomes a luxury. Then do what allows you to keep the main line: honesty with yourself and the intention to correct things later, when it is possible to return to reasoning. Socrates reminded that philosophy as a way of life requires constancy and patience, not a one-off act of will. If you make these techniques part of your day, thought will cease to be a game and will become an ability to live that cannot simply be switched on and off. Philosophical habit also protects against superficial busyness. It teaches you to stop the flow of reactions and return to tested principles. This does not mean turning into a soulless robot of rules. On the contrary, responsibility to oneself creates space for compassion and flexibility. When a rule is articulated clearly and then tested in life, stability and trust in one's own judgment arise. Practice includes patience with mistakes. Correction is part of training, not proof of impotence. Environment matters too. People who encourage unprepared improvisation can hinder the development of discipline, but they are not obliged to break it. The choice of company is also an act of philosophy. Finally, the goal is not to become a perfect thinker, but to give yourself a tool for a more honest and calmer life. If philosophical exercises become habitual, you will be less prone to panic, better able to distinguish the significant from the secondary, and calmer in enduring trials. Start with a small step today. The aim of dialogue is to clarify motives, find out what exactly drives actions and assertions, and bring terms into such a state that they can become a guide to action. Dialogue is aimed at clarity within a person and between people, at making words cease to be mere ornamentation of dispute and become working tools for life. When concepts have clear boundaries, decisions find support, and motives cease to be vague excuses. Why this is important and how it works. Dialogue begins with the premise that conversation is a way to explore the inner landscape, not a way to secure one's position. At the level of reasons, This grows out of the desire to live coherently. Actions should correspond to what you consider valuable. The structure of dialogue consists of a series of questions, precise definitions, and sequential checking of the links between assertions and behavior. Questions reveal hidden assumptions, definitions put concepts in place, and checking removes logical gaps. The consequences of this approach are pragmatic. People more clearly see what their choices stand for, self-justifications are reduced, and the willingness to change practice in light of clarified grounds increases. In this role, dialogue becomes not an exercise in eloquence, but a procedure for isolating the moments where morality and knowledge intersect. The boundaries of this goal must be kept open and conscious. Dialogue cannot clarify motives where there is no readiness to look honestly at oneself, where conversation turns into a display of status or manipulation. In conditions of strong emotional tension, threat, or domination of one voice over the others, the process becomes formal and loses its investigative character. Dialogue is also limited when societies or structures impose unilateral answers instead of joint inquiry. In such cases, words serve to bolster power and cease to be an instrument of self-examination. It is important to consider that clarification requires time and repetition, and quick public disputes for effect rarely lead to genuine change of motivations. The connection of this idea with Socratic practice is obvious and multi-layered. Socrates structured conversations so that the roots of assertions would be visible and discussable. Each move in his reasoning sought to bring hidden bases of opinion to light and to show what actions follow from them. His questions turned abstract words into definite concepts, and through this clarification, a person became more responsible for his own choice. It seems important to me that Socrates did not see the triumph of the orator. He cultivated a mind capable of seeing its motivations and measuring them by their relation to the notion of the good. If you enter dialogue with that aim, you give yourself a chance to take steps based on clarity, not on habitual verbal gestures. The aim of dialogue is to clarify motives, find out what exactly drives actions and assertions, and bring terms into such a state that they can become a guide to action. Dialogue is aimed at clarity within a person and between people, at making words cease to be mere ornamentation of dispute and become working tools for life. When concepts have clear boundaries, decisions find support, and motives cease to be vague excuses. Why this is important and how it works. Dialogue begins with the premise that conversation is a way to explore the inner landscape, not a way to secure one's position. At the level of reasons, this grows out of the desire to live coherently. Actions should correspond to what you consider valuable. The structure of dialogue consists of a series of questions, precise definitions, and sequential checking of the links between assertions and behavior. Questions reveal hidden assumptions. Definitions put concepts in place, and checking removes logical gaps. The consequences of this approach are pragmatic. People more clearly see what their choices stand for. Self-justifications are reduced, and the willingness to change practice in light of clarified grounds increases. In this role, dialogue becomes not an exercise in eloquence, but a procedure for isolating the moments where morality and knowledge intersect. The boundaries of this goal must be kept open and conscious. Dialogue cannot clarify motives where there is no readiness to look honestly at oneself, where conversation turns into a display of status or manipulation. In conditions of strong emotional tension, threat, or domination of one voice over the others, the process becomes formal and loses its investigative character. Dialogue is also limited when societies or structures impose unilateral answers instead of joint inquiry. In such cases, words serve to bolster power and cease to be an instrument of self-examination. It is important to consider that clarification requires time and repetition, and quick public disputes for effect rarely lead to genuine change of motivations. The connection of this idea with Socratic practice is obvious and multi-layered. Socrates structured conversations so that the roots of assertions would be visible and discussable. Each move in his reasoning sought to bring hidden bases of opinion to light and to show what actions follow from them. His questions turned abstract words into definite concepts, and through this clarification, a person became more responsible for his own choice. It seems important to me that Socrates did not seek the triumph of the orator. He cultivated a mind capable of seeing its motivations and measuring them by their relation to the notion of the good. If you enter dialogue with that aim, you give yourself a chance to take steps based on clarity, not on habitual verbal gestures. The practice of such dialogue requires skills that can be developed. The ability to ask clarifying questions, the patience to listen to answers without premature judgments, and the readiness to revise one's conclusions. It is important to learn to distinguish identifying motivations from looking for someone to blame. The first is correct and useful. The second often turns into accusation and a defensive stance. Practically, this looks like this. Instead of immediately rejecting another's position, it is useful to ask what is important to the person at its core, which needs they are trying to satisfy, and which fears guide their arguments. Often, the answer to such questions unexpectedly changes the emotional tone of the discussion. When it becomes clear that behind the words there is concern for children, for work, or for honesty, the dispute ceases to be a personal attack and takes on the appearance of a joint solution to a practical problem. But critical control is also important. Clarification does not absolve one from the responsibility to check facts, analyze consequences, and keep the bounds of logic. Sometimes the motivation is noble, but the consequences are harmful. Then dialogue should point to this gap and help find other ways. Courage to admit mistakes and persistence in changing practice are essential conditions. Honest dialogue creates the ability to act more precisely and with greater meaning. A common problem in discussions is that speech loses honesty with respect to logic itself. People allow inconsistencies in their assertions, use vague definitions, and accept consequences convenient for themselves, without checking for internal contradiction. This undermines what makes reasoning useful, the ability to see where your words lead and what actions they justify. Socrates constantly pointed to such failures. For him, logical honesty was a moral requirement, not a technical trick. The criterion of logical honesty is simple and strict. First, terms must be clear. If you speak of justice, explain what you mean by that word. Second, assertions must be consistent with one another. If one assertion entails a consequence, you are obliged to accept that consequence or correct the original position. Third, acknowledge the limits of your knowledge and state the degree of confidence in your judgments. For Socrates, it was precisely clarity of concepts, the sequence of arguments, and the courage to admit ignorance that formed the ethical standard of thought. Why does this matter for your actions and for society as a whole? How often are personal decisions made under the pressure of habit or public opinion, rather than guided by tested logic? When logical honesty is present, discussion ceases to be a contest for reputation and becomes an instrument for improving action. I have seen how changing the wording of one key idea in a conversation freed a person from an old justificatory pattern and moved the discussion into the practical realm of responsibility. Analyzing consequences shows concrete effects. Where thought is consistently structured and accompanied by an admission of doubt, trust among participants grows, and there is an opportunity to correct practices before they cause harm. Political decisions, legal norms, everyday agreements benefit from an honest approach to arguments. Fewer mistakes, fewer opportunistic excuses. Conversely, if logic is used selectively, self-deception and moral fuzziness arise. The consequences of good intentions turn out harmful because no one checked their causal links. Socrates emphasized that knowledge and action must go together, and logical honesty becomes the bridge between thought and moral choice. The limits of this ideal must also be kept in view. Logical honesty does not remove insufficient data and does not provide instant answers in situations of strong emotional pressure or in the face of threats to life. Sometimes one must act on heuristics and partial information, and admitting this limits claims to absolute logicality. The communication system and power structures can also hinder the application of strict argument testing. Where access to information is restricted, or where an asserted consequence benefits the powerful, honest dialogue loses force. Socrates taught working with what it is possible to clarify and change. You can strive for logical honesty, understanding that it requires time, patience, and conditions in which discussion actually leads to testing beliefs. If you want to practice this, start small. Define key concepts, make sure your conclusions really follow from the premises, and say how confident you are. Socrates showed that even partial honesty toward logic changes the character of actions. It makes you less vulnerable to self-justifications and more responsible to those affected by your decisions. Self-correction is a practical mechanism. You notice the divergence between what you believe and how you act. You question the formulations and grounds of your convictions. You try alternatives in practice and make adjustments to behavior and concepts. This process consists of observing your own reactions, consistently questioning motives and outcomes, external verification, and reintroducing new judgments into everyday life. The whole system works like a cycle in which each iteration calibrates the link between thought and action a little more accurately. The internal mechanism relies on several stable techniques. First, accessible embarrassment or contradiction draws attention. Then, questions are asked to separate superficial arguments from those grounded in verifiable foundations. Experience and dialogue provide feedback. After that, small-scale experimentation begins. A different way of speaking, a different action, and the result is recorded. Elenchus tends to reveal contradictions. Meiotics helps give birth to clearer concepts. And constant care for the soul turns these corrections into habit rather than episodic exertions of will. The reason this matters lies in the very purpose of philosophy for Socrates. If reasoning does not lead to a change of character and behavior, it remains an external game of words. Self-correction turns knowledge into action. When you correct a mistaken model of the world, the decisions you make change as well. This is a direct path to responsibility toward those affected by your actions, and to reducing recurring errors that cause harm and erode trust. The mechanism breaks down for obvious reasons. Pride and attachment to the image of a good reasoner turn admitting error into a threat to identity. Social incentives encourage defensive reactions and excuses, when admitting mistakes is reputationally costly. Limited information and certain emotional traumas make changes hard to implement because the mind does not receive clear feedback. Finally, imitation of correction, public apologies without internal reworking, creates the illusion of transformation while behavior remains the same. The limits of this path are important for practice. External coercion can force different behavior, but it does not guarantee internal change. Changing character requires time, repetition, and often the support of an environment that values honesty in thought. Sometimes it is necessary to distinguish what you can change yourself from what requires institutional change or the help of others. Recognizing these boundaries keeps the practice realistic and coherent. Practical steps look simple when reduced to routine. Notice irritation or a feeling of justification and ask yourself about the causes. Clearly formulate the reasoning that led to the action. Seek counter-arguments and test consequences in small trials. Ask an ally to point out invisible blind spots and record the result. Repeat the cycle until new habits become part of character. These actions slowly turn self-correction from a rare effort into a durable way of life. Putting it all together means seeing how self-correction links the key semantic supports. Conscious admission of ignorance sets the search for correction in motion. Dialogical practice reveals inconsistencies and helps produce clear definitions. Logical honesty makes each correction a moral act because knowledge and action become compatible. Care for the inner life turns individual corrections into a change of character, and that is the goal of philosophy as a way of life. I believe this is available to anyone willing to accept small pieces of evidence and work with them honestly. Start with one simple step. Name yesterday's mistake aloud and try to understand what exactly led your reasoning astray. Then, change your next action in accordance with the new understanding. This will be training for the soul, where knowledge is translated into practice, and where character is formed by a constant readiness to correct oneself.